Who do you think you are, walking in here like you own the place? This is my station, not some charity center for people like you. His voice cut through the room like a whip, laced with arrogance and disdain. The woman paused, her hand tightening around the folder she carried, every muscle in her body tense. She hadn't expected a warm welcome, but this was something else entirely. I'm here for official business, she said firmly, refusing to let the sting of his words show. But her calm seemed to fuel his anger. He stepped closer, his boots echoing on the cold, tiled floor, his presence towering and menacing. The eyes of others in the room darted away. No one intervened. They never did. Official business, he scoffed, leaning in as if to make her feel smaller. People like you don't belong in places like this. Don't waste my time. Turn around and leave before you embarrass yourself further. Her voice didn't waver as she tried again. I have the authority to be here. Step aside. Authority. The word hit him like a challenge, and his reaction was swift and brutal. He grabbed the folder from her hands, tossing it aside like it was trash, then gestured aggressively toward the door. I don't care what you think you're here for. You don't have authority over anything in my house. Now get out, or I'll drag you out myself. The room felt suffocating as the tension mounted. Every gaze was on her now, judging, pitying, but none stepping forward to help. Her dignity felt like it was slipping through her fingers, yet she stood firm. Touch me, and you'll regret it, she said, her voice low but steady. He laughed, a cold, mocking sound that echoed in the room. Regret it? You don't even know who you're dealing with. But in truth, neither did he. It wasn't the physical shove or the humiliation of being forced back toward the door that hurt the most. It was the silence, the complicity of every officer and staff member who stood there, watching, as if this was nothing out of the ordinary. Not one voice rose to object, not one hand reached to help her pick up the folder now scattered on the floor. Don't come back, he barked, his voice loud enough to ensure everyone heard, as if this moment was some twisted badge of pride for him. Next time, I won't be so nice. As the door closed behind her, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The faces of the onlookers, the smirk of the man who thought he'd put her in her place, they were all burned into her memory. She walked away, her heart pounding not with fear but with fury. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next day, the same man strutted into the briefing room, his voice booming with the overconfidence of someone who thought the world was his to command. He didn't notice the uneasy glances from his colleagues, didn't pick up on the strange hush that fell over the room when the door opened behind him. When she walked in, the air changed. Gone was the woman who had been humiliated and dismissed the day before. She moved with purpose, her presence undeniable, her authority unquestionable. Every step she took was a statement, I am here, and I will not be ignored. And then he saw her. His face twisted in disbelief as she stood at the front of the room, commanding the space he had arrogantly claimed as his own. She turned, her gaze locking on his, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his actions. The silence was deafening. Good morning, she began, her voice calm but cutting through the tension like a blade. I am your new chief of police. The shock rippled through the room, but no one was more stunned than him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The arrogance that had fueled him only hours ago was nowhere to be found. He looked around, searching for an ally, but all he found were the same silent faces that had watched his humiliation play out. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. Instead, she let the moment stretch, the weight of her words settling over him like a storm cloud. We have a lot of work to do, she continued, her gaze never leaving his. And let me make one thing clear, there is no room for discrimination, arrogance, or abuse of power in this department. Not anymore. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. How could this be happening? How could the woman he treated like nothing now hold the power to decide his fate? The tables had turned, and as the realization sank in, the ground beneath him seemed to crumble. But the real question was yet to be answered: what would she do next? And what would become of him? Stay tuned to find out how this shocking turn of events unfolds, and the price he'll pay for his arrogance. You won't believe what happens next. To all our black viewers, we want to take a moment to say this: Plow of Twist stands firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. Your stories, your struggles, and your triumphs matter, and we're here to amplify those voices. Together, we can build a future rooted in respect, equality, and justice. Thank you for being here with us today. Now, enjoy the story we've crafted for you. It's one of resilience, justice, and redemption. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and join our community. Let's get started with the story. The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of her modest office, casting long streaks of light across a cluttered desk covered with files, a steaming mug of coffee, and a small framed photo of a young boy. Alyssa Monroe, 38, a name that few in the public knew but many in law enforcement circles respected, had spent her entire career navigating a system that wasn't designed with her in mind. Born and raised in a small, predominantly black neighborhood in Atlanta, Alyssa knew from a young age that the world wasn't fair. She saw it in the way her parents, hardworking and proud, were treated with suspicion in stores. She saw it in the way her older brother was stopped and frisked for simply walking home from school. And she felt it, deeply, every time her dreams of becoming a police officer were met with raised eyebrows and dismissive laughter from those who believed she wouldn't last a day in the uniform. But Alyssa was not one to back down. If anything, the resistance only fueled her determination. She excelled academically, earning a degree in criminology while working double shifts at a diner to support her family. By the time she joined the force, she was already braced for the uphill battle she knew awaited her. And she was right. The early years were brutal: microaggressions from colleagues, blatant disrespect from some superiors, and the constant need to prove that she belonged. But through sheer grit, integrity, and an unshakable belief in justice, she rose through the ranks, earning the respect of those who initially doubted her. Now, decades later, Alyssa had been appointed chief of police in a city that desperately needed change. But stepping into this new role felt like stepping into the lion's den. The department she inherited was riddled with scandals, allegations of corruption, reports of excessive force, and a community that no longer trusted those sworn to protect them. For Alyssa, this wasn't just a professional challenge, it was personal. She wasn't just trying to fix a broken system, she was fighting to prove that it could be fixed at all. On her first day, the city bustled with its usual rhythm. In the heart of the downtown district, the police station stood as a looming structure, gray and cold, reflecting the culture within. Inside, officers moved through the halls with practiced indifference, exchanging murmurs of gossip and sidelong glances as Alyssa made her way to her new office. Despite her reputation, she knew many of them saw her as an outsider. Some didn't even bother to hide their skepticism. Meanwhile, across the department, Officer Bradley Connor, 45, embodied everything Alyssa was up against. A seasoned cop with a swagger that suggested he'd seen it all, Bradley had built a reputation not for his bravery or skill, but for his arrogance and short temper. He was a product of the system Alyssa sought to dismantle, a man who had thrived within its flaws, using his badge to wield power rather than serve. Bradley's colleagues knew better than to cross him, and the rookies learned quickly to stay out of his way. He was a relic of the old guard, a reminder of the department's darker days, and he had no intention of making room for reform. Bradley's personal life mirrored his professional demeanor, messy and self-serving. Divorced twice, he lived alone in a cramped apartment filled with unpacked boxes and takeout containers. He was the type of man who believed his badge made him untouchable, who laughed off sensitivity training and dismissed complaints as the whining of soft people. To him, Alyssa's appointment was not just an inconvenience, it was an affront. A woman, a black woman, coming in to tell him how to do his job. He couldn't stomach it. That morning, Alyssa arrived at the station earlier than most, ready to observe the dynamics at play before her official introduction. She dressed sharply, her tailored navy suit a quiet assertion of her authority, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced tougher battles than any she would encounter here. She walked through the station's halls, her presence unannounced, noting the subtle signs of dysfunction, stressed dispatchers, officers ignoring complaints, and a culture of apathy that permeated the air. When she entered the bullpen, a young officer directed her to a waiting area near the conference room. She sat quietly, her folder in hand, as the morning shift rolled in. That's when Bradley entered the scene, his booming voice cutting through the noise. He was complaining about something, probably a parking ticket or a rookie's mistake, and immediately made his way toward her. "Who are you supposed to be?" he barked, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. Alyssa barely glanced at him, keeping her composure. But her silence only irritated him further. "Hey, I'm talking to you. You lost or something? You don't belong back here." She looked up then, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'm here for a meeting," she said simply. But that wasn't good enough for Bradley. "A meeting? With who? You don't look like anyone important," he sneered, crossing his arms. "This area's for officers only. Why don't you head back out front where you belong?" Alyssa tightened her grip on the folder, her mind racing with a dozen ways to respond. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, watching to see how she would handle the confrontation. She wanted to fire back, to remind him that he didn't know who he was talking to, but she held her tongue. She knew this wasn't the time. Bradley, mistaking her silence for submission, smirked and leaned closer. "That's what I thought. Go on, before you waste any more of my time." She stood then, towering over him despite the difference in their physical stature. "I'm not wasting anyone's time," she said, her voice steady. "You'll see soon enough." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the room in stunned silence. Bradley watched her go, his smirk fading into confusion, and muttered to no one in particular, "What's her deal?" Little did he know, the answer to that question would change everything, for him, for Alyssa, and for the department. And the storm that was about to break would leave no one untouched. The first few days after Alyssa Monroe's quiet yet resolute entrance into the precinct were a study in contrasts. For most of the officers, her presence was a curiosity, something to be observed from a safe distance, whispered about behind closed doors, and dismissed with half-hearted skepticism. But for Bradley Connor, her existence was an affront he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just her position that bothered him, it was everything about her. The calm way she carried herself, the way she never raised her voice yet commanded attention, the way her sharp eyes seemed to catch every little detail in the room. Bradley felt it like a weight on his shoulders. He told himself it was her attitude that grated on him, but deep down, there was something else, something he couldn't put into words, a gnawing discomfort he refused to acknowledge. It started small, with comments muttered under his breath when she passed by. "Think she's too good to talk to us," he'd say to whoever was nearby, always just loud enough for her to hear. If she noticed, she never reacted. That infuriated him even more. By the end of the first week, Bradley couldn't resist pushing the boundaries further. One morning, during the department's routine briefing, Alyssa entered the room with her usual composed demeanor, ready to address the team. The chatter quieted as she approached the podium, but Bradley didn't follow suit. Leaning back in his chair, he let out an exaggerated yawn, then muttered to his neighbor, "Great. Another lecture about how we're all supposed to hold hands and sing Kumbaya." The room fell silent, every eye darting between him and Alyssa. For a moment, she paused, her gaze locking on his with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. She didn't respond to his comment, didn't give him the satisfaction of rising to the bait. Instead, she began the briefing with a steady voice, outlining the department's plans for restructuring and community engagement. But even as she spoke, Bradley could feel her gaze brushing past him, like a quiet warning. It sent a shiver down his spine, though he'd never admit it. After the meeting, Bradley lingered in the hallway, waiting for her to emerge. When she finally stepped out, he intercepted her, blocking her path with an exaggerated smile. "That was quite the speech, Chief," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Real inspiring stuff. You've got a knack for words, I'll give you that." Alyssa stopped, tilting her head as she studied him. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet curiosity that made him feel exposed. "If you have concerns about the direction we're taking, Officer Connor, you're welcome to bring them to me directly," she said evenly. "My door is always open." Bradley barked out a laugh. "Yeah, I'll keep that in mind," he said, his tone mocking. "But I think I've seen enough to know where this is going. You can put all the lipstick you want on this department, but it's still the same underneath. You can't change the system, Chief. It's bigger than you." She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "The system doesn't change overnight, officer. It changes one person at a time. And whether you believe it or not, you're part of that change." Her words hung in the air as she walked away, leaving Bradley standing there, fuming. He told himself she was delusional, that her optimism was a waste of time. But her calm, unshakable confidence gnawed at him, lingering in the back of his mind like an unwelcome guest. In the days that followed, the tension between them escalated. Bradley went out of his way to challenge her authority, questioning her decisions in meetings, dragging his feet on new policies, and spreading doubt among his colleagues. He thought he was winning, thought he was showing her that she didn't belong here. But the truth was, his antics only made her more determined. One afternoon, Alyssa called a meeting to discuss an internal investigation into allegations of misconduct within the department. The room was packed, the atmosphere tense. Bradley, as usual, sat in the back, arms crossed, his expression daring her to challenge him. "This investigation isn't about pointing fingers," Alyssa began, her voice steady. "It's about accountability and restoring the trust of the community we serve. I know this isn't easy to hear, but the only way forward is through transparency and integrity." Bradley couldn't help himself. Transparency? Integrity? That's rich, coming from someone who doesn't even know what it's like to walk a beat in this city. The room went silent. Alyssa turned to face him, her gaze sharp but calm. "You're right, Officer Connor," she said, surprising everyone. "I haven't walked a beat in this city. But I've spent my entire career fighting for the kind of accountability that builds trust, not tears it down. If you have a different perspective, I'm happy to hear it. But let's keep this discussion focused on solutions, not personal attacks." Her response caught him off guard. He expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even a reprimand. But her composure left him with nothing to push against, nothing to fuel his disdain. And that made him angrier than anything. As the weeks passed, Bradley's frustration boiled over. He became more reckless, cutting corners on his cases, ignoring protocol, and lashing out at anyone who questioned him. His colleagues began to distance themselves, wary of being caught in the crossfire. And Alyssa, ever watchful, let him dig his own grave. One evening, she called him into her office. The tension was palpable as he stepped inside, his jaw set, his posture defiant. She gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing. "Officer Connor," she began, her tone calm but firm. "I've noticed a pattern in your behavior lately. It's disruptive, unprofessional, and it's affecting the morale of this department. I need to know if there's an underlying issue we need to address." He scoffed, crossing his arms. "My only issue is this department turning into a circus under your leadership." She didn't react to the insult. Instead, she leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "This isn't about me, Bradley. This is about you. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's time for you to reconsider your place here." Her words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, Bradley felt a flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor he'd built around himself. But he shoved it aside, refusing to let her see his vulnerability. The meeting ended without resolution, but the seeds of change had been planted. As Bradley left her office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as he thought. And for Alyssa, the confrontation was just the beginning. She knew the storm was coming, and she was ready. What neither of them realized was just how much that storm would change everything. The precinct buzzed with an unspoken tension that morning, a charged energy that seemed to crackle in the air like static before a storm. Officer Bradley Connor sat at his desk, rifling through reports with a practiced indifference that barely masked his irritation. Around him, the usual chatter of officers had given way to hushed conversations and wary glances. Something was brewing, but Bradley dismissed it as more of Alyssa Monroe's heavy-handed leadership, another pointless meeting or policy announcement designed to flex her authority. When the announcement came for all personnel to gather in the briefing room, Bradley rolled his eyes but rose with the others. He took his usual seat at the back, arms crossed and posture rigid, radiating defiance. Alyssa entered moments later, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to demand silence, it followed her like a shadow. The room stilled, all eyes on her as she took her place at the podium. Bradley's smirk faltered as he noticed something different in her demeanor, an edge, sharp and unyielding. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "I've called this meeting because there are issues within this department that can no longer be ignored. Transparency and accountability are not just words, they are principles we must uphold if we are to regain the trust of this community." Bradley leaned back in his chair, a derisive chuckle escaping his lips. Alyssa paused, her gaze cutting through the room and landing squarely on him. For a moment, the tension between them was palpable, a silent battle of wills. Then she continued, her voice unwavering. "In the past weeks, an internal investigation has brought to light several instances of misconduct, actions that have not only undermined the integrity of this department but have also endangered the people we are sworn to protect. These actions will not be tolerated." The words hung heavy in the air, and Bradley felt a prickle of unease. He glanced around, searching for support, but found only averted gazes and stiff postures. Something was wrong. Alyssa's eyes swept the room, her expression unreadable, before settling back on him. Her next words landed like a hammer. "Officer Connor, would you please step forward?" The room went deathly silent. Bradley froze, his mind racing. He forced a laugh, the sound hollow and strained. "What's this about, Chief? Another one of your lectures?" Alyssa didn't flinch. "Step forward, Officer Connor." Her tone brooked no argument, and for the first time, Bradley felt the weight of her authority pressing down on him. Slowly, reluctantly, he rose from his seat and made his way to the front of the room. Every step felt heavier than the last, the eyes of his colleagues boring into his back. When he reached the podium, he turned to face her, his smirk firmly in place though his heart hammered in his chest. "Let's hear it, Chief. What's your big reveal?" Alyssa stepped aside, gesturing to the screen behind her. "Let's start with this." The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. Bradley's smirk vanished as footage began to play. It was grainy but unmistakable, security camera footage from the hallway outside the conference room. It showed him, standing over Alyssa with that same smug expression, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. His voice echoed through the room, dripping with disdain. "You don't belong back here." The footage cut to another clip, this one showing him berating a young rookie, his tone condescending and aggressive. Then another, of him ignoring protocol during a traffic stop, his behavior reckless and dismissive. Each clip was a nail in the coffin, a damning testament to his arrogance and disregard for the rules. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Bradley's face flushed red, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the evidence. He turned to Alyssa, his voice rising in anger. "This is a setup. You've had it out for me since day one. This is all part of your agenda." Alyssa met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. This isn't about me, Officer Connor. This is about your actions. Actions that have consequences. He laughed, the sound bitter and desperate. Consequences? For what? For doing my job. For not bending over backward to appease your little crusade. Alyssa took a step closer, her voice lowering but gaining in intensity. Your job is to serve and protect, not to abuse your authority or demean those around you. This isn't a crusade, officer. It's accountability. And it's long overdue. Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He looked around, seeking support, but his colleagues avoided his gaze. The silence was deafening, a stark reminder that he was alone. Alyssa turned back to the room, addressing the assembled officers. This department has a choice to make. We can continue to allow this kind of behavior to fester, or we can take a stand and demand better, for ourselves, for each other, and for the community we serve. She looked back at Bradley, her eyes hard but not without a trace of something deeper, disappointment, perhaps, or pity. Officer Connor, effective immediately, you are suspended pending further investigation. You will be escorted from the premises. Bradley's jaw dropped, his mind reeling. He turned to the officers behind him, searching for someone, anyone, to intervene. But they remained silent, their expressions a mix of discomfort and resolve. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, he had no allies left. As two officers stepped forward to escort him out, Bradley finally found his voice. This isn't over, he spat, his words dripping with venom. You think you've won, but you haven't. You're just a temporary blip, Monroe. The system will swallow you whole. Alyssa didn't respond. She didn't need to. The door closed behind Bradley with a finality that echoed through the room, and the tension began to dissipate. Alyssa turned back to the podium, her expression resolute. This is just the beginning, she said, her voice steady. We have a long road ahead, but together, we can rebuild this department into something we can all be proud of. The officers watched her, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and hope. For the first time, they began to see the possibility of change, not just in the department, but in themselves. And as the room emptied, Alyssa stood alone, staring at the empty chairs and knowing that the real work was only just beginning. But she was ready. As Bradley Connor was escorted out of the precinct, his mind raced with a mix of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. The sting of Alyssa Monroe's words still echoed in his ears, but it wasn't just her voice, it was the silence of his colleagues, their refusal to speak up for him, to back him as they once might have. That silence weighed heavier than anything she had said. He had thought himself untouchable, a fixture of the department, but now it was as if the very walls that had once felt so familiar were turning their backs on him. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper, biting against his flushed skin as he stepped into the parking lot. He stopped walking abruptly, yanking his arm away from the officer lightly guiding him, his voice erupting. Get your hands off me. I know my way out. The officer didn't argue, only nodded stiffly and stepped back. Bradley stood there for a moment, his fists clenched, his jaw tight, before he finally walked to his car. His mind churned with the events that had just unfolded. How had it come to this? How had he allowed himself to be blindsided so completely? Inside the precinct, Alyssa remained in the briefing room, her eyes scanning the faces of the officers who had stayed behind, lingering in their seats. She could see the unease in their expressions, the silent questions they were too afraid or too uncertain to ask. She took a slow, deliberate breath and then spoke, her voice calm but firm. I know today was difficult to witness. I know many of you feel conflicted, maybe even angry. And I understand that change is uncomfortable, especially when it forces us to confront things we'd rather ignore. But what happened today wasn't just about Officer Connor. It's about accountability, for all of us. For this department, and for the people we've sworn to protect. One of the younger officers, a rookie named Martinez, shifted uncomfortably in his seat before speaking up, his voice hesitant. Chief, do you really think this is going to change anything? I mean, he's been here longer than most of us. People like him, they don't just disappear. Alyssa nodded, acknowledging the weight of his words. You're right, Officer Martinez. People like him don't just disappear, and the culture he represents doesn't either, not overnight. But this isn't about erasing the past. It's about taking responsibility for it and making a choice about what kind of future we want to build. That starts here. It starts now. Martinez nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Across the room, another officer, a veteran named Torres, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke, his tone skeptical but not unkind. You've got guts, Chief, I'll give you that. But guts don't always get the job done. What happens when the people up top start pushing back? When they decide it's easier to let things go back to the way they were? Alyssa's gaze sharpened, her determination unshaken. Then we push back harder. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't come without resistance. But it's worth fighting for. And I'm not asking you to follow me blindly, I'm asking you to hold yourselves and each other to a higher standard. Because if we don't, then we're no better than the problems we claim to stand against. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy fog. Slowly, Torres nodded, his expression softening. Fair enough, Chief. Let's see if you can back it up. Alyssa met his gaze and gave a small, resolute nod. You'll see. As the meeting ended and the officers filed out, Alyssa returned to her office, her mind still spinning from the events of the day. She knew the hardest battles were yet to come. Bradley might have been the loudest voice of opposition, but he wasn't the only one. There were others who shared his views, others who would try to undermine her at every turn. And then there was the community, watching closely, waiting to see if her promises of change would translate into action. The weight of their expectations was heavy, but Alyssa had carried heavier burdens before. She could carry this one too. Across town, Bradley sat in his dimly lit apartment, the silence pressing in on him like a physical force. The anger that had burned so hot earlier had cooled into something darker, something heavier. He replayed the meeting in his mind, Alyssa's calm, steady voice contrasting with his own anger and desperation. He hated her for what she had done, for the way she had stripped him of his authority, his dignity. But more than that, he hated the way her words had lingered, gnawing at the edges of his certainty. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he pressed call. The voice on the other end answered after a few rings, gruff and impatient. What do you want, Connor? You're not exactly in a position to be making demands. Bradley's voice was steady, but there was a desperation lurking beneath it. I need to fix this. I need to find a way to take her down before she does any more damage. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low chuckle. You're in over your head, Bradley. You should have seen this coming. Don't lecture me, Bradley snapped, his frustration boiling over. I need your help. Are you in or not? The voice on the other end sighed. Fine. But you'd better be sure about this. Once we start, there's no going back. Bradley's grip on the phone tightened. I'm sure. She's not going to get away with this. The line went dead, leaving Bradley alone in the silence once more. His mind raced with plans, strategies, ways to regain the power he felt slipping through his fingers. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, Alyssa's words kept coming back to him, an unwelcome echo in the quiet. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Alyssa sat at her desk, reviewing the files that had been piling up since her first day. The work was endless, but it was also a reminder of why she had taken this job in the first place. She thought of the community she had sworn to protect, the people who had placed their trust in her, and the officers who were beginning to see that change was possible. It was a heavy burden, but it was one she was willing to carry. As the night stretched on, the city outside her window seemed to hum with a quiet tension, a sense that something was shifting, something was coming. And as Alyssa prepared for the battles ahead, she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The aftermath of the meeting left a ripple effect that neither Alyssa Monroe nor Bradley Connor could fully predict. Within the precinct, the tension lingered, but something else had begun to take shape. The officers, many of whom had been hesitant or outright dismissive of Alyssa's leadership, now found themselves re-evaluating their positions. The footage she had revealed, the consequences she had enforced, it all signaled a shift that couldn't be ignored. Conversations that were once whispers in the hallways grew louder, more reflective. People began questioning not just Bradley's actions but their own complicity in allowing such behavior to go unchecked for so long. For Alyssa, the days following the confrontation were a delicate balancing act. She had made her stance clear, but now came the harder part: following through. She worked tirelessly, reviewing policies, meeting with community leaders, and setting up training sessions to address the systemic issues she had inherited. Each step forward felt like progress, but she knew the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. Every small victory was tempered by the knowledge that not everyone supported her vision. Bradley's departure had left a void, but it was one that others seemed eager to fill. One morning, as Alyssa walked into the precinct, she was met with a wave of murmured conversations. The air felt heavier than usual, the tension palpable. She made her way to her office, her instincts immediately alert. It wasn't until she sat down at her desk that she noticed the envelope waiting for her, a plain, unmarked envelope placed carefully in the center of her workspace. She opened it cautiously, her eyes scanning the contents. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, typed message: "You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late." Her initial reaction was a mix of frustration and resignation. Threats weren't new to her, they were an unfortunate reality of her position. But this one carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The timing, the phrasing, it all pointed to someone inside the department. She folded the note and placed it in her desk drawer, deciding to address it later. For now, she couldn't afford to let fear distract her from the work at hand. Meanwhile, Bradley's absence was beginning to take its toll in unexpected ways. While some officers viewed his suspension as a necessary step toward progress, others saw it as a warning, a reminder that no one was untouchable. This unease began to manifest in subtle ways. Reports were delayed, protocols were overlooked, and morale dipped as officers grappled with the new reality Alyssa was creating. For those who had grown comfortable in the old system, change felt like a threat. For others, it was an opportunity. Bradley, on the other hand, wasn't content to fade quietly into the background. In his mind, his suspension was an injustice, a personal attack orchestrated by Alyssa to make an example of him. He spent his days nursing his anger, replaying the events in his mind, searching for a way to regain control. The contact he had reached out to after the meeting had been cautious, warning him against rash actions. But Bradley's desperation made him reckless. He began compiling information, reaching out to old connections, trying to piece together anything he could use against Alyssa. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by files and half-empty beer bottles, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from the contact, a single line that sent a jolt of adrenaline through him: "We might have something. Meet me tomorrow." Bradley stared at the screen, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what the information was or how it could be used, but it was a lifeline, a chance to turn the tide in his favor. The following day, Bradley met his contact in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city. The man slid a folder across the table, his expression unreadable. "This is what I could find," he said, his voice low. "But you need to be careful. If this backfires, it's on you." Bradley opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. It wasn't much, just fragments of information, hints of connections Alyssa had made during her career. But to Bradley, it was enough. He saw an opportunity to twist the narrative, to paint her as a manipulative outsider who didn't have the department's best interests at heart. He thanked the man, pocketing the folder, and left the bar with a renewed sense of purpose. Back at the precinct, Alyssa was preparing for another meeting when Officer Torres knocked on her door. He stepped inside, his expression hesitant. "Chief, I need to talk to you," he said, his tone serious. Alyssa gestured for him to sit, sensing the gravity of his demeanor. Torres leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Look, I've been here a long time. I've seen a lot of things that didn't sit right with me, but I kept my head down because that's what everyone does. But after what happened with Connor, it made me realize that staying silent isn't an option anymore. I don't agree with everything you're doing, but I respect that you're trying. And I want to help." Alyssa regarded him carefully, her expression softening. "Thank you, Torres. That means a lot. Change isn't easy, and it's not something I can do alone. Having someone with your experience and perspective on board makes a difference." Torres nodded, his resolve clear. "Just tell me what you need, Chief. I'm in." The conversation was a rare moment of encouragement for Alyssa, a reminder that her efforts weren't in vain. But even as she felt a flicker of hope, the unease from the anonymous threat lingered at the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something she couldn't yet see. As the days passed, Bradley's plan began to take shape. He leaked snippets of the information he'd gathered, planting seeds of doubt among his former colleagues and the media. Rumors began to circulate about Alyssa's past, her motivations, her connections. The whispers grew louder, threatening to overshadow the progress she had made. For Alyssa, it was a test of her resilience, a reminder that leadership often came with a cost. But Alyssa wasn't one to back down. She met the rumors head-on, addressing them with the same calm determination that had defined her career. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that the battles she faced would be both external and internal. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. Slowly but surely, she was building a team of allies, people who believed in her vision and were willing to fight for it. As the precinct braced itself for the next chapter, the tension reached a boiling point. The lines had been drawn, the stakes were higher than ever, and the choices each person made would shape the future of the department. And while Alyssa prepared to face whatever came next, Bradley waited in the shadows, convinced that his moment of redemption, or revenge, was just around the corner. The precinct's atmosphere remained charged, the tension building like a storm about to break. Alyssa Monroe could feel it in the way her officers interacted, their guarded conversations, the careful way they watched her when they thought she wasn't looking. She was no stranger to resistance, it came with the territory of dismantling a culture of complacency, but this felt different. The rumors Bradley had seeded were beginning to take root, feeding into the doubts and fears of those who still resented her presence. One morning, as she reviewed reports in her office, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Torres, a simple but urgent request: "We need to talk. Now." Alyssa didn't hesitate, immediately heading to the briefing room where Torres was waiting, his expression grim. He stood as she entered, nodding toward the door. "Can we make this private?" She closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she crossed her arms. "What's going on, Torres?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck, his usual confidence faltering. "I've been hearing things. About you. About your past. Officers are starting to ask questions, and it's not looking good, Chief." Alyssa's jaw tightened, though her voice remained steady. "What kind of questions?" Torres sighed, his frustration evident. "They're saying you've got connections outside the department, people pulling strings for you. That you're using this position to push some kind of agenda. It's all bullshit, I know, but it's gaining traction. And Connor, he's not done, Chief. He's still working against you, and I think he's behind these rumors." Alyssa's expression hardened, her mind racing through the implications. "Do you have proof he's involved?" Torres shook his head. "Not yet. But I know how he operates. He's always been good at stirring the pot, getting people riled up. If we don't shut this down, it's going to get worse. Alyssa exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. I appreciate you bringing this to me, Torres. I'll handle it. But I need you to keep your ears open. If you hear anything concrete, anything that can tie this back to Connor, I want to know immediately. He nodded, his resolve clear. You've got it, Chief. As Torres left the room, Alyssa sat down, her hands resting on the table as she stared at the blank wall ahead of her. The challenges she faced weren't just about policy or reform, they were deeply personal, rooted in fear and resentment. She had known this job would be difficult, but the constant need to defend her integrity, to prove herself in the face of relentless doubt, was exhausting. Meanwhile, Bradley was reveling in the chaos he had sown. From the safety of his apartment, he watched the precinct's turmoil unfold through whispers and second-hand reports. Each piece of doubt he planted felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming the control he had lost. But even as he celebrated, there was a growing unease in the back of his mind. He had underestimated Alyssa once, and the memory of her unshakable composure in the face of his defiance lingered like a ghost. Still, his anger drowned out any trace of caution. To him, this was a war, and he was determined to win. Late one night, Alyssa sat in her office, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. She was reviewing a stack of files, her focus sharp despite the late hour. The knock at her door startled her, and she glanced up to see Officer Martinez standing hesitantly in the doorway. Come in, Martinez, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. What's on your mind? Martinez sat down, his posture tense. He looked down at his hands before meeting her gaze. Chief, I think there's something you need to know. I overheard a conversation in the locker room earlier. Some of the guys were talking about you, about how you're only here because someone higher up wants you to be. They didn't say much, but it sounded like they were trying to figure out if there was any truth to it. Alyssa nodded, her expression unreadable. Thank you for telling me, Martinez. Did they mention any names? Anything specific? He shook his head. No names. Just speculation. But it's spreading, and people are starting to listen. She leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the implications. I appreciate your honesty, Martinez. This kind of gossip only distracts us from the work we need to do. I'll address it, but I need you to focus on your job and not get pulled into the noise. Understood? Yes, Chief, he said, standing to leave. Before he reached the door, he turned back, his expression earnest. For what it's worth, I believe in what you're doing. Not everyone does, but some of us see it. Don't let them get to you. His words, though simple, carried a weight that stayed with her long after he left. Alyssa had faced resistance her entire career, but this felt different. It wasn't just about her leadership, it was about who she was, what she represented. And that made it personal. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, investigations, and carefully crafted responses to the growing rumors. Alyssa knew she had to tread carefully. Any misstep could validate the doubts swirling around her. But she also knew that silence wasn't an option. She began reaching out to her allies, building a network of support both inside and outside the department. Slowly, she started to regain control of the narrative, countering the rumors with facts and transparency. Bradley, however, wasn't done. He had one final move planned, one he believed would be the ultimate blow to Alyssa's credibility. He contacted a reporter known for sensationalist stories, offering an exclusive interview with the promise of explosive revelations about the new chief of police. The reporter, eager for a headline, agreed without hesitation. The interview aired late one evening, a barrage of accusations and half-truths designed to paint Alyssa as an opportunist with ulterior motives. Bradley watched it unfold with a smug satisfaction, certain that he had finally won. But his victory was short-lived. The next morning, Alyssa held a press conference. Standing in front of the precinct, flanked by officers who supported her, she addressed the accusations head-on. Her voice was calm but unwavering as she laid out the facts, dismantling Bradley's claims with precision. She didn't shy away from the challenges she faced, acknowledging the resistance to change but reaffirming her commitment to the community and the department. By the time she finished, the crowd was silent, their skepticism replaced with a grudging respect. Even those who had doubted her began to see the strength of her character, the resilience that had brought her this far. And for Bradley, the realization began to sink in, he hadn't broken her. If anything, he had only made her stronger. The precinct seemed quieter than usual, but the silence wasn't comforting, it was heavy, loaded with unspoken tension and unvoiced concerns. Alyssa Monroe walked through the halls with her usual composed demeanor, but she could feel the unease in the air. Officers who had once whispered behind her back now avoided her gaze entirely. The rumors that Bradley had planted were taking root, spreading like wildfire through the department. Alyssa had anticipated resistance, but the insidious nature of these attacks cut deeper than she had expected. They weren't just questioning her leadership, they were questioning her integrity, her character. In her office, she sifted through the day's reports, but her focus wavered. The words on the pages blurred as her mind replayed the conversations she'd had over the past few days. She thought of Torres, his quiet support a beacon in the storm, and of Martinez, who had stopped by that morning to assure her that not everyone believed the lies. Still, the weight of the situation bore down on her, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. The knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Torres again, his expression serious as he stepped inside. "Chief, you need to see this," he said, handing her a tablet. Alyssa took it, her eyes narrowing as she read the headline on the screen. It was a news article, its tone scathing, filled with allegations about her past. The claims were vague, but they were enough to sow doubt among those who didn't know her. Alyssa set the tablet down, her jaw tightening. She looked up at Torres, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "They're digging," she said simply. "Trying to find anything they can use against me." Torres nodded, his expression grim. "It's not just the media. Some of the officers here, they're starting to talk, questioning whether you're really here to help or if you've got your own agenda." Alyssa leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "I knew this wouldn't be easy, Torres. But I didn't think they'd stoop this low. These lies, they're not just about me. They're about undermining everything we're trying to build here." Torres hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Do you think it's Connor? I know he's suspended, but this feels personal." Alyssa's eyes darkened. She had considered the possibility, but hearing it voiced aloud made it feel more real. "It has his fingerprints all over it," she said finally. "But proving that is another matter entirely." As the conversation continued, the tension in the room grew. Torres leaned forward, his voice lowering. "What do you want to do, Chief? If you want to fight this head-on, you'll need more than just the truth. You'll need people willing to stand with you, to speak out against what's happening." Alyssa met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I won't let this derail us, Torres. I didn't come here to play politics, I came here to make a difference. But you're right. I can't do this alone." Torres nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Then let's start building that support. The ones who believe in what you're doing, they need to see that you're not backing down." As Torres left her office, Alyssa took a deep breath, centering herself. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that giving up wasn't an option. She began making calls, reaching out to community leaders, activists, and even former colleagues who could vouch for her character. Slowly but surely, she began to gather allies, people who were willing to stand by her despite the storm swirling around her. Meanwhile, Bradley Connor sat in the shadows of his apartment, watching the chaos unfold with a mix of satisfaction and bitterness. The articles, the rumors, it was all falling into place. But as he sipped his drink, he couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind. Alyssa's words during their last confrontation echoed in his head, her calm demeanor unnerving even in memory. For all his bravado, Bradley couldn't shake the feeling that he had underestimated her. That night, as Alyssa drove home, her phone buzzed with a notification. She pulled over to check it, her brow furrowing as she read the message. It was anonymous, just like the note she had received earlier. But this time, the tone was different. You think you've won, but you haven't. The truth always comes out. Alyssa stared at the screen, her mind racing. The words felt like a warning, but they also carried an edge of desperation. Whoever was behind this was running out of moves, and they knew it. She saved the message, making a mental note to forward it to the tech team in the morning. As she drove the rest of the way home, the city lights blurred in her peripheral vision, her thoughts consumed by the battle ahead. The next morning, Alyssa arrived at the precinct early, her mind sharp despite the restless night. She gathered her team, Torres, Martinez, and a handful of other trusted officers, and laid out a plan. They would counter the rumors with facts, confront the lies with transparency. It was a gamble, but it was the only way to regain control of the narrative. As the day unfolded, Alyssa faced a barrage of questions from both the media and her own department. Each time, she responded with measured honesty, refusing to be baited into anger or defensiveness. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Allies who had remained silent started to speak up, their voices adding weight to her own. Community leaders released statements of support, and even some of the more skeptical officers began to reconsider their positions. Bradley watched it all unfold from a distance, his frustration mounting. The plan he had so carefully orchestrated was unraveling before his eyes. He slammed his fist against the table, the sound echoing in his empty apartment. For the first time, he felt the sting of doubt, not just in his ability to take Alyssa down, but in the righteousness of his actions. He told himself it was too late to turn back, but the thought lingered, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. As the precinct began to settle into a tense but hopeful rhythm, Alyssa prepared for the next step in her plan. She knew the battle wasn't over, but she also knew she was no longer fighting it alone. And while Bradley plotted his next move, the seeds of change Alyssa had planted continued to grow, their roots taking hold in the cracks of a broken system. The storm was far from over, but for the first time, the light of a new dawn seemed within reach. The precinct thrummed with a sense of cautious optimism. Though the department still bore the scars of its troubled history, Alyssa Monroe's leadership had begun to take root in ways no one could have predicted a year prior. Officers moved with renewed purpose, policies were being implemented to foster accountability and equity, and the once tense atmosphere had shifted. Alyssa walked the halls with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The road ahead was still long, but the progress made thus far was undeniable. For Alyssa, the memory of Bradley Connor's downfall remained vivid. His hearing, a culmination of weeks of investigation and mounting evidence, had been a turning point not just for the department but for her personally. Watching him face the consequences of his actions wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, recordings of his misconduct, testimonies from colleagues who had grown tired of his behavior, and his own documented violations of protocol. The panel's decision to terminate his employment and permanently revoke his badge had been unanimous. In that moment, as Bradley sat before the panel, his face a mask of forced indifference, Alyssa had felt a mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also a trace of pity. Bradley had been a product of the system he upheld, a man who had thrived in its flaws but was ultimately destroyed by them. Alyssa knew that his removal was necessary, but it was also a stark reminder of the work still to be done. Bradley was not the cause of the department's issues, he was a symptom. After his dismissal, the department had been forced to confront its culture head-on. Alyssa doubled down on her efforts to implement meaningful reform. She introduced new training programs that emphasized community engagement, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of de-escalation. She worked closely with community leaders to rebuild trust, attending town hall meetings and listening to the concerns of residents who had long felt marginalized and ignored. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply rewarding. For the first time, Alyssa felt that her vision for a better department was within reach. Within the precinct, the ripple effects of Bradley's departure were evident. Some officers, emboldened by Alyssa's leadership, stepped forward to support her initiatives. Martinez, once hesitant and unsure of his place, had grown into a confident and capable officer. His recent promotion to sergeant was a testament to his hard work and Alyssa's belief in his potential. Torres, too, had become one of Alyssa's staunchest allies. His initial skepticism had given way to respect, and his experience and insight proved invaluable as they navigated the challenges of reform together. But not everyone embraced the changes. A small but vocal faction of officers resisted Alyssa's efforts, clinging to the old ways and viewing her leadership as a threat to their power. Rumors and whispers of dissent circulated, but Alyssa faced them with the same calm determination that had defined her career. She knew that change was never easy, and she refused to let fear or resistance deter her. Bradley, meanwhile, was forced to confront the fallout of his actions. Stripped of his badge and the authority that had defined him, he found himself adrift. At first, his anger consumed him. He blamed Alyssa, the department, and even his colleagues for his downfall. But as the weeks turned into months, he began to reflect on the choices that had led him to this point. The therapy sessions he reluctantly attended became a lifeline, a space where he could begin to unravel the biases and insecurities that had driven his behavior. It was a painful and humbling process, but it was also necessary. In one session, Bradley's therapist asked him a question that stuck with him: "What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?" The question haunted him, forcing him to confront the reality that his legacy, as it stood, was one of arrogance, abuse of power, and missed opportunities. Slowly, he began to understand the depth of the damage he had caused, not just to others, but to himself. 1 year after her appointment, Alyssa stood at a podium in a packed community center. The event was a celebration of the department's progress, a chance to reflect on how far they had come and to recommit to the work that lay ahead. Alyssa spoke with clarity and conviction, acknowledging the challenges they had faced and the mistakes that had been made. She emphasized that their progress was not the result of one person's efforts, but a collective commitment to doing better. The crowd's applause was loud and sustained, but it was the reactions of her officers that mattered most to Alyssa. Torres stood near the front, his expression one of quiet pride. Beside him was Martinez, who had become a symbol of the department's future. The young sergeant's journey from uncertainty to leadership was a testament to what could be achieved when people were given the tools and support they needed to succeed. As the event wound down, Alyssa took a moment to reflect. She thought about the people who had supported her, the battles she had fought, and the lessons she had learned. She thought about Bradley, whose absence was both a reminder of the past and a warning for the future. And she thought about the community she had sworn to serve, the people who had placed their trust in her despite years of broken promises. That trust was fragile, but it was also powerful. For Bradley, the path to redemption was still unfolding. He had begun volunteering at a community center, a small but meaningful step toward making amends. Though he would never wear a badge again, he found a sense of purpose in helping others, a purpose that had eluded him for much of his life. The anger that had once defined him was still there, but it was tempered by a growing understanding of the man he wanted to become. Alyssa's story is one of resilience, determination, and the belief that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming resistance. It's a reminder that leadership isn't about perfection, it's about accountability, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And Bradley's journey, though painful, shows that redemption is possible, but it requires us to confront the truths we'd rather ignore. What do you think of this journey? Did you see yourself in Alyssa's unwavering resolve, in Torres's transformation, or even in Bradley's hard-fought redemption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more narratives that challenge, inspire, and surprise, be sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next story.